Now we are on to reading, academic reading passage 1. This is passage 1, and this is of IELTS 8. So let us read the passage and we'll answer question 1 to 13. These are the questions which are following. So, my advice would be to first always go to the questions and try to read it so that you are aware that what you need to extract from the content means the reading. So, before we can answer this, let us read it first. So, the advice is to spend 20 minutes for question 1 to 13, which is based on reading passage. So, this is a chronicle of timekeeping. Our conception of time depends on the way we measure it. You can pause it or you can just listen to me. A. According to archaeological evidence, at least 5,000 years ago, and long before the advent of Roman Empire, the Babylonians began to measure time, introducing calendars to coordinate communal activities to plan the shipment of goods, or in particular to regulate planting and harvesting. They based their calendars on three natural cycles: the solar day, marked by successive periods of light and darkness on Earth, rotates on its axis; the lunar month, following the phases of the moon or its orbit, orbits the Earth; and the solar system, defined by changing seasons that accompany our planet's revolution around the sun. Second is before the invention of artificial light, the moon had greater social impact. And of course, living near the equator, in particular, its waxing and waning are more conspicuous than the passing of the seasons. Hence, the calendars that were developed at the lower altitudes were influenced more by the lunar cycle than by the solar cycle. In more northern cities or times, however, where seasonal agriculture was practiced, the solar year became more crucial. As the Roman Empire expanded northward, it organized its activity chart for the most part around the solar year. So, centuries before Roman Empire, the Egyptians had formulated a municipal calendar having 12 months or 30 days, with 5 days on the year added to approximate the solar year. Each period of 10 days was marked by the appearance of special groups of stars called decans. At the rise of the stars, Sirius just before sunrise, which occurred around the all important annual flooding of the Nile, 12 decans could be seen spanning the heavens. The cosmic significance of Egyptians placed in the 12 decans led them to develop a system in which each interval of darkness and later each interval of daylight was divided into a dozen equal parts. These periods became known as temporal hours because the duration varied according to the changing length of days and nights with the passing of the seasons. Summer hours were longer, winter ones short. Only at the spring and autumn equinoxes were the hours of daylight and darkness are equal. Temporal hours, which were first adopted by the Greeks and then the Romans, who disseminated them through Europe, remained in use for more than 2500 years. In order to track temporal hours during the day, inventors created sundials, which indicate time by the length or direction of the sun's shadow. The sundial's counterpart, the water clock, was designed to measure temporal hours at night. One of the first water clock was the basin with small hole near the bottom through which the water dripped out. The falling water level denoted the passing hour as it dipped below our lines inscribed on the inner surface. Although these devices performed satisfactorily around the Mediterranean, they could not always be depended on in the cloudy and often freezing weather of northern Europe. The advent of mechanical clock meant that although it could be adjusted to maintain temporal hours, it was naturally suited to keeping equal ones. With these, however, arose the question when to begin counting, and so in the early 14th century, a number of systems evolved. The schemes that divided the day into 24 equal parts varied according to the start of the count. Italian hours began at sunset, Babylonian hours at sunrise, astronomical hours at midday, and great clock hours used for some large public clocks in Germany at midnight. Eventually, these were superseded by small clock or French hours, which split the day into two 12 hours period commencing at midnight. Then the earliest recorded weight-driven mechanical clock was built in 1283 in Bedfordshire in England. The revolutionary aspect of this new timekeeper was neither the descending weight that provided its motive force, nor the gear wheels, which has been found for at least 1300 years, that transferred the power. It was a part called the escapement. In the early 1400s came the invention of the coiled spring or fusee, which maintained constant force to gear wheels of the timekeeper despite the changing tension of its mainspring. By the 16th century, a pendulum clock had been devised, but the pendulum swung in a large arc and thus was not very efficient. Now, to address this, a variation on the original escapement was invented in 1617 England. It was called the anchor escapement, which was a lever-based device shaped like a ship's anchor. The motion of the pendulum rocks this device so that it catches and then releases each tooth of the escape wheel, in turn allowing it to turn a precise amount. Unlike the original form used in early pendulum clocks, the anchor escapement permitted the pendulum to travel in a very small arc. Moreover, this invention allowed the use of long pendulum, which could beat once a second, and thus led to the development of new floor-standing case design, which became known as the grandfather clock. Today, highly accurate timekeeping instruments set the beat for most electronic devices. Nearly all computers contain a quartz crystal clock to regulate their operation. Moreover, not only do time signals beam down from GPS, that is Global Positioning System satellites, calibrate the function of precision navigation equipment, they do so as well for mobile phones, instant stop trading system, and nationwide power distribution grids. So integral have these time-based technologies become today existent that our dependency on them is recognized only when they fail to work. Now let us answer these queries. We have paragraphs from A to H, and which paragraph contains what? These are four statements. So let us run through them. First is a description of an early timekeeping invention affected by cold temperatures. So this was in D. If you can go back. So here, if you can really see that this freezing weather of northern Europe, this was mentioned. Then we have an explanation of the importance of geography in the development of the calendar in farming communities. So this was being told in B. So now, if we have learned it very carefully, but still, this is where the content is, because it was seasonal agriculture was practiced, so it was crucial. Then a description of the origins of the pendulum clock. So this was being discussed in F. Pendulum clock description of origins. So here the earliest recorded wind-driven mechanical clock was built in this Bedfordshire. Then fourth is details of the simultaneous efforts of different societies to calculate time using uniform hours. This was in E. So here 24 equal parts and 12 equal parts, 12 hours in by French. So this is how we indicate or link the paragraphs with this content or these statements. Now we have questions from 5 to 8. These are from nationalities A to F, and we have to link that which event with is linked with which nationality. So fifth is they devised a civil calendar in which the months were equal in length. So fifth was Egyptians. Then they divided the day into two equal halves. Sixth, they were French from midnight. So this will be 6. And then they divided a new cabinet shape for a type of timekeeper, 7. And they were the English, 7. And they created a calendar to organize public events and work schedules, 8. And those were the Babylonians. Now, this was a description of a machine actually, how the 1670 lever-based device worked. So you have to go to that particular paragraph where it was being described, and no more than 2 words needs to be used. The 12 is a dash which beats each dash. So this is a ship's anchor or simply an anchor which beats the this is 9. Sorry, this will start with 9. Okay, escapement resembling A. This is just looking like an anchor. So this was actually an anchor. This is anchor. 10th is this is a wheel. So this is a wheel. 11 is these are the tooths, sawtooth. And then we have L12. Now here the dash with beats each 13. So this is a pendulum, and it beats each second, SD second. So now let us move on to reading passage 2. Again 20 minutes for 14 to 26. And choose the correct heading for paragraphs A and C, G. A, C. A, C, these are various paragraphs, and these are the headings. So choose the correct heading for paragraph A and C to G. So all these you have to mention from the list below and write the correct number in your answer sheet. So this is disobeying of FAA regulations, aviation disaster prompt action, two coincidental developments, setting altitude zones, an oversimplified view controlling pilots' licenses, defining airspace categories, setting rules to weather conditions, and taking safe or off safety, and first steps towards ATC. So this is air traffic control in the USA, and after reading this, we will answer from 14 to 19 and more coming. So, an accident that occurred in the skies over the Grand Canyon in 1956 resulted in the establishment of Federal Aviation Administration to regulate and oversee the operation of aircraft in the skies over the United States, which are becoming quite congested. The resulting structure of air traffic control has greatly increased the safety of flight in the United States, and similar air traffic control procedures are also in place over much of the rest of the world. B. Rudimentary air traffic control existed well before the Grand Canyon disaster. As early as the 1920s, the earliest air traffic controllers manually guided aircraft in the vicinity of the airports using lights and flags, while beacons and flashing lights were placed along cross-country routes to establish the earliest airways. However, this purely visual system was useless in bad weather, and by the 1930s, radio communication was coming into use for ATC. The first region to have something approximating today's ATC was New York City, with other major metropolitan areas following soon after. So, in the 1940s, ATC's centers could and did take advantage of newly developed radar and improved radio communication brought about by Second World War, but the system remained rudimentary. It was only after the creation of FAA that full-scale regulation of America's airspace took place, and this was fortuitous, for the advent of jet engines suddenly resulted in a large number of very fast planes, reducing pilots' margin of error and practically demanding some set of rules to keep everyone well separated and operating safely in the air. Many people think that ATC consists of a row of controllers sitting in front of chair radar screens at the nation's airport, telling arriving and departing traffic what to do. This is very incomplete part of the picture. The FAA realized that the airspace over the United States would at any time have many different kinds of planes flying for many different purposes in a variety of weather conditions, and the same kind of structure was needed to accommodate all of them. And to meet this challenge, the following elements were put into effect. First, ATC extended over virtually the entire United States, in general from 365 m above the ground and higher. The entire country is blanketed by controlled airspace. In certain areas, mainly near airports, controlled airspace extends down to 215 meters above the ground and in the immediate vicinity of the airport, all the way down to the surface. Controlled airspace is that airspace in which FAA regulations apply. Elsewhere, the uncontrolled airspace, pilots are bound by few regulations. In this way, the recreational pilot who simply wishes to go flying for a while without all the content will be just because there are various paragraphs which are coming. The restrictions imposed by FAA has only to stay in uncontrolled airspace below 365 meters. But the pilot who does want the protection afforded by ATC can easily enter the controlled airspace. The FAA then recognized two types of operating environments. In good meteorological conditions, flying would be permitted under Visual Flight Rules (VFR), which suggests a strong reliance on visual cues to maintain an acceptable level of safety. Poor visibility necessitated a set of instrumental flight rules (IFR), under which the pilot relied on altitude and navigational information provided by the plane's instrument panel to fly safely. On a clear day, a pilot in controlled airspace can choose a VFR or IFR flight plan, and the FAA regulations were devised in a way which accommodates both VFR and IFR operations in the same airspace. However, the pilot can only choose to fly IFR if they possess an instrument rating which is above and beyond the basics pilot license that must also be held. Then the final is controlled airspace is divided into several different types designated by letters of the alphabet. Uncontrolled airspace is designated Class F, while controlled airspace below 5490 meter above sea level and not in the vicinity of an airport is in Class E. All airspace above 5490 meter is designated Class A. The reason for the division of Class E and Class A airspace stems from the type of planes operating in them. Generally, Class E airspace is where one finds general aviation aircraft. A few can climb above 5490 anyway, and the commercial turboprop aircraft. Above 5490 is the realm of heavy jets, since jet engines operate more efficiently at higher altitudes. The difference between Class E and A airspace is that in Class A, all operations are IFR and the pilots must be instrument rated, that is, skilled and licensed aircraft instrumentation. This is because ATC control of the entire space is essential. Three other types of airspace, class B, C, D, govern the vicinity of airports. These correspond roughly to small municipal, medium-sized metropolitan and major metropolitan airports respectively, and encompass an increasingly rigorous set of regulations. For example, all a VFR pilot has to do to enter class C airspace is establish two-way radio contact with ATC. No explicit permission from ATC to enter is needed, although the pilot must continue to obey all regulations governing VFR flight. To enter Class B airspace, such as an approach to a major metropolitan airport, an explicit ATC clearance is required, and the private pilot who cruises without permission into this airspace risks losing their license. So we'll come to these question 20 to 26 and we'll go back to from where we started. These are question 14 to 19. I read the headings just because I wanted you to concentrate on which heading will match which paragraph. So question is 14th, paragraph A. 14th, paragraph A. So this was 2. Aviation disaster prompt action. And then we have paragraph C, and this is 15. This is our third. 2 coincidental developments. 15. 16 is paragraph D. So what is given here? The heading could be in 16. It can very well be an oversimplified view. 17 is paragraph E, and the heading can be 17. It can be setting altitude zones. 18, paragraph F. This will be setting rules of weather conditions. And then finally G will have the heading as, this is 19, so it will be our 7th, defining airspace categories. Now as we have read already, so we'll directly go to question 20 to 26, which is true, which is false, which is not given for these statements. So 20 is, the FFA was created as a result of the introduction of the jet engine. This is false. The 21 is, air traffic control started after the Grand Canyon crashes in 1956. So this is pretty false because it was well started in 1920s. 22, beacons and flashing lights are still used in ATC today. 22, this is not given. We get a feeling that okay, it could be true, but this is not given. 23rd, some improvements were made in radio communicating during World War II. 23, this is true. Class of airspace is airspace which is below 365 meter and not near airports. 24, and this is true. All aircrafts in Class E airspace must use IFR. 25, this is false. They are not required to do it. Then a pilot entering Class C airspace is flying over an average size city. This is true. Now the final passage, that is passage 3, this is about telepathy. So let us see that these are the questions, right? And these are the questions from 27 to 40. So there are various questions which we need to answer on the basis of this telepathy. So 20 minutes are given for this. Telepathy. Can human beings communicate by thought alone? For more than a century, the issue of telepathy has divided the scientific community, and even today it still sparks bitter controversy among top academics. Since the 1970s, parapsychologists at leading universities and research institutes around the world have risked the derision of skeptical colleagues by putting the various claims for telepathy at the test in dozens of rigorous scientific studies. The results and their implications are dividing even the researchers who uncovered them. Some researchers say the results constitute compelling evidence that telepathy is genuine. Other parapsychologists believe the field is on the brink of collapse, having tried to produce definitive scientific proof and failed. Skeptics and advocates alike do concur on one issue, however, that the most impressive evidence so far has come from the so-called Ganzfeld experiments, a German term that means whole field. Reports of telepathic experience had by people during meditation led parapsychologists to suspect that telepathy might involve signals passing between people that were so faint that they were usually swanned by normal brain activity. In this case, such signals might be more easily detected by those experiencing meditation-like tranquility in a relaxing whole field of light, sound, and warmth. The Ganzfeld experiment tries to recreate these conditions with participants sitting in soft reclining chairs in a sealed room listening to relaxing sounds while their eyes are covered with special filters, letting in only soft pink light. In early Gansfield experiments, the telepathy test involved identification of a picture chosen from a random selection of four taken from a large image bank. The idea was that a person acting as a sender would attempt to beam the image over to the receiver relaxing in the sealed room. When the session was over, this person was asked to identify which of the four images had been used. Random guessing would give a hit rate of 25%. If telepathy is real, however, the hit rate would be higher. In 1982, the results from the first Gansfield studies were analyzed by one of its pioneers, the American parapsychologist Charles Houghton. They pointed to typical hit rates of better than 30%, a small effect, but one which statistical tests suggested could not be put down to chance. The implication was that the Gansfield methods had revealed real evidence for telepathy, but there was a crucial flaw in this argument, one routinely overlooked in more conventional areas of science. Just because chance had been ruled out as an explanation did not prove telepathy must exist. There were many other ways of getting positive results. These range from sensory leakage, where clues about the pictures accidentally reach the receiver, to outright fraud. In response, the researcher issued a review of all the Gansfield studies done up to 1985 to show that 80% had found statistically significant evidence. However, also agreed that there were still too many problems in the experiment which could lead to positive results, and they drew up lists demanding new standards for future research. After this, many researchers switched to auto-Gansfield test, an automated variant of the technique which used computers to perform many of the key tasks such as random selection of images. By minimizing human involvement, the idea was to minimize the risk of flawed results. In 1987, results from hundreds of auto-Gansfield tests were studied by Houghton in a meta-analysis, a statistical technique for finding the overall results from a set of studies. Though less compelling than before, the outcome was still impressive. Yet some parapsychologists remain disturbed by the lack of consistency between the individual Gansfield studies. Defenders of telepathy point out that demanding impressive evidence from every study ignores one basic statistical fact. It takes large samples to detect small effects. If, as current results suggest, telepathy produces hit rates only marginally above the 25% expected by chance, it's unlikely to be detected by a typical Gansfield study involving around 40 people. The group is just not big enough. Only when many studies are combined in a meta-analysis will the faint signal of telepathy really become apparent. And that is what researchers do seem to be finding. So what they are certainly not finding, however, is any change in attitude of mainstream scientists. Most still totally reject the very idea of telepathy. The problem stems at least in part of the lack of any plausible mechanism for telepathy. Various theories have been put forward, many focusing on esoteric ideas from theoretical physics. They include quantum entanglement, in which effects or event affecting one group of atoms instantly affect another group, no matter how far apart they may be. While physicists have demonstrated entanglement with specially prepared atoms, no one knows if it also exists between atoms making up human minds. Answering such questions would transform parapsychology. This has prompted some researchers to argue that the future lies not in collecting more evidence for telepathy, but in probing possible mechanisms. Some work has begun already with researchers trying to identify people who are particularly successful in auto-Gansfield trials. Early results show that creative and artistic people do much better than average. In one study at the University of Edinburgh, musicians achieved a hit rate of 56%. Perhaps more tests like this will eventually give the researchers the evidence they are seeking and strengthen the case for the existence of telepathy. Now we have just heard or read the content, and we'll go to the question answer series. So complete each sentence with the correct ending. Write the correct letter A to G in boxes 27 to 30 on your answer sheet. So we'll write it here only. We'll try to match. Researchers with differing attitudes toward telepathy agree on the significance of the Gansfield experiments. The reports of experiences during meditation indicated the need to create a suitable environment for telepathy. Attitudes to parapsychology would alter drastically with the discovery of mechanism for telepathy. Recent auto-Gansfield trials suggest that success rate will improve with a more careful selection of subjects. And now, no more than 3 words from 31 to 40. Gansfield study 1982, auto-Gansfield studies 1987. Description is involved a person acting as this would be a sender. Short form, I'll write the short form SR. Who picked out 1? 32 would be picture or image. You can write either picture or you can write either image. From a random selection of 4 and 33 you can write receiver, RR, receiver. Results hit rates were higher than random guessing, and flaw is positive results could be reduced by factors such as 34 and 35. In either order you can write sensory leakage or fraud. So sensory leakage or fraud. Then 36. Dash were used for key tasks to limit the amount of 37 would be computers. Amount of dash in carrying out the test, that is human involvement. The results were then subjected to 38 would be meta-analysis, AMA, meta-analysis. Then the dash between different test results was put down to the fact that sample groups were not dash with most organized study. 39 would be the lack of consistency between different test results were put down to the fact that sample groups were not big or large enough. You can write just big, or you can also write large enough, LE. So this was our academic reading of test 1, IELTS book 8. Thank you so much. Take care.